Good evening, everyone. I'm Sandra Davis, here with my colleague Tamu Jones of the California Endowment. We are so very excited to welcome you tonight to California Live. At Cal Live, our mission is to provide health and racial equity programming for social change that is open for all and free for the public good. I can see that we have lots of folks on from around the country and around the world, so we are very happy to welcome you. Before we dive into our discussion, I want to remind everyone tuning in that this conversation is being recorded and will be posted on the California Endowment's website tomorrow, so look for that. We'll send everyone the link and the recording, and you can share it with friends who couldn't be here, or take another look at it for yourself. Before tuning into our featured guests, we want to introduce you to Rodolfo Garcia, who will be providing Spanish language interpretation services for us tonight. He has some instructions for us. Take it away, Rodolfo.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Hello, everyone. I would like just to switch to Spanish now. Solo quiero darle un poco de las instrucciones que se necesitan para poder tener acceso a la interpretación en español. Si están usando la tableta, paso 1, seleccionar más Language Interpretation, el círculo que vemos ahí, y únicamente seleccionar español. Si está en la computadora, en la parte de abajo deberían de ver un globo que dice Interpretation. Solo denle clic ahí y se puede seleccionar la opción de español. Y por último, si está en algún teléfono inteligente, un smartphone, igual los 3 puntitos donde dice More, Language Interpretation, y seleccionar la opción de español. Muchas gracias. And I think that will be all, Sandra.
All right. So I guess we're ready to get started. You want to do a special shout out to the high school students that are on today. I see lots logging on from various high schools from around the country. Welcome. We are beyond excited and incredibly humbled to introduce one of the most important philosophers, scholars, and movement leaders of our time, the incomparable legend and our very special guest, Dr. Angela Davis. Thank you everyone who shared questions in advance, and we have a packed agenda and more than, I think over 3,000 people that have registered for this that are in our audience. So we won't have too much time for additional questions, but we're gonna include as many audience voices as possible. The chat feature is open now, and you can comment on anything that you find interesting or suggest questions you'd like Dr. Davis to answer. So now I'm just going to kick it over to you, Tamu.
Great. Thank you, Sandra and Dr. Davis. Such an honor, again, to be in conversation with you tonight. If any of you have any knowledge whatsoever of our guest tonight, you know that Dr. Angela Davis has been active in social justice work since she was a very young woman. And for over 50 years, she has inspired movements and young people around the world. Dr. Davis, who or what would you say inspired you most in your youth? Can you tell us a little bit about the first time you realized you had the power to take action and make a difference in the world?
Well, thank you so much for the question. Am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much for the question, but before I attempt to answer it, I'd like to first of all thank the California Endowment for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And hello to everyone who has joined us. It's wonderful to see that so many people are participating in this program. Now, I learned when I was a very young child that it was not necessary to accept things the way they are. And I have my parents to thank for this insight. Neither one of them was ever supposed to do anything more than become very poor farmers in a rural area of Alabama, where farming could barely provide the means of subsistence for individuals or families. So my parents were both born in the rural South, less than 50 years after the putative end of slavery. But they both passionately believed that change was possible. And they ended up finishing high school and going to college at a time when the most that you could expect of Black children was getting through elementary school. Both of my parents were members of the NAACP when that was tantamount to being members of the Communist Party. Yeah. My mother joined the Southern Negro Youth Congress and fought for the freedom of the Scottsboro Nine for many, many years. And she actually lived to see them released from prison. So that I learned growing up that struggle could produce results, maybe not immediate results, but in the long term, change would happen. I don't know when my first political act took place, but I do know that I consciously decided at the age of 11 to join an interracial discussion group at my church. And it was the first congregational church. And as a result of those discussions, the church was burned. So already at 11, I understood the consequences of resistance. But maybe let me tell just one more story, and that might give people a sense of how learning to stand up and fight back and resist can be a part of the way one grows up. I lived in an area in Birmingham that had just recently opened the neighborhood where we lived to Black people. So my parents were one of the first Black families that bought a house in that area. On the other side of the street, the neighborhood was zoned only for white people. So it was literally illegal for us to cross the street. And we all knew that. But as children, we developed these games in which we dared each other to run across the street and to even run up the stairs, to run up the steps and ring the doorbell of white people who we later found out were members of the Ku Klux Klan. So we did that when we were like 5 and 6 years old. So resistance is a part of how I learned how to live my life.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Davis. And I think what I would probably share, I mean, you were one of my biggest inspirations growing up. And I would say my first act of resistance was probably as a really young child when I had long flowing curly hair and I begged my sister to cut my hair into an afro. And I was 10 years old. And it was an act of defiance because my parents were so insistent on us growing our hair and looking like girls. And I just did not, I first of all, wasn't really into looking like a girl. And so this was my first act of defiance. And you were one of the inspirations for that. So defiance, so brave to me. So thank you for that. And obviously we could go at length talking about your political development. And we really encourage folks to, look into all of the materials that are readily available to folks to read about your life and your past. You've written so much, you've spoken so much. But what we want to take a good chunk of today doing is really getting your insights into what's happening today, what we're being faced with today. How incredibly lucky we are to have a leader with your depth of experience to provide us with perspective and help us make sense of these times today. As you know, we're in the middle of a global pandemic that has turned everything upside down and has had a deep and devastating impact on peoples and communities around the world. It's laid bare all of the economic, political, social inequities popular movements have been fighting for decades. And just after the pandemic lockdown here in the US, as you know, the police murder of George Floyd in May of 2020 reignited the movement for Black lives and brought thousands of people to the streets, uprising and civil disobedience in this country, and solidarity demonstrations in countries around the world. Dr. Davis, you have been one of the leading thinkers and advocates of intersectional movement building and international solidarity to create change. Can you share some thoughts about the challenges and opportunities for power building and intersectional international movement building created by the pandemic and the uprising against police violence and terror?
Well, first of all, I think it's extremely important to recognize that even though we are not now still in that phase of huge demonstrations in the streets of people participating by the millions, this is not a reason to assume that the time of movement building has passed. This is precisely the moment when we should be consolidating our movement structures. My experience has been that it's not often possible to predict these moments, such as the one we experienced in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's murder, his police lynching, we might say. We can't predict those moments when a collective consciousness takes shape. And of course, in the spring of 2020, we were moving into the pandemic. We were just recognizing that of the impact of the pandemic, of all of the different characteristics of that impact, what was perhaps most striking was the fact that Indigenous people and Black people and Latinx people were the ones who were suffering most. We learned the term essential workers. We learned how important Black people and people of color are to the functioning of this country. And that, of course, has always been the case. The country was built on colonialism and slavery. Now, for many years, many of us have been talking about the fact that racism is structural. It's not so much about what one individual thinks about another individual. However, the idea that racism is an individual phenomenon, that it is about attitudes, that it is about something that an individual can change. Many of us have been arguing that racism is built into the system. It's built into the very structures, the social and economic and political structures of this society. The pandemic revealed that. We saw the structural character of racism. We saw how racism is built into the healthcare system, especially a healthcare system that is privatized and that is so linked to global capitalism. And armed with that insight, we were all in many ways compelled to collectively experience the lynching of George Floyd. And I think that the way in which we all watched the videos that circulated all over the country and all over the world, it had the features of what you might call a modern day lynching bee. And so I think it was the confluence of those events that permitted people to recognize the truth of what so many activists have been saying for so long. So, I want to come at this question from a slightly different point of view, because we tend to assume that the uprisings were spontaneous, that people kind of spontaneously decided to participate in these great collective uprisings. But keep in mind that people have been organizing against police violence and against other manifestations of structural racism for decades and decades, even centuries. I've often said that I can I can narrate the history of my own involvement by the various cases involving Black people who have been killed by the police. So this was a confluence of events. It was, what you might call a conjunctural moment. This collective consciousness of structural racism in relation to the police lynching of George Floyd happened at a time when we were all primed to recognize police assaults on people of color as something far more dangerous than the activity of individual police officers. And I emphasize this because oftentimes as activists, we do the work and we don't see the results. And we work for years and sometimes for decades without actually seeing tangible, palpable consequences. But then a moment emerges, such as the conjunctural moment of last spring, and then the consequences begin to make themselves seen. And this is a lesson to activists who oftentimes want to see immediate results. Sometimes the results are not immediate, but if you stop, then you will never see the results. If you continue, then eventually you get to experience the fruits of all of the labor. And I think for me, let me say that this period has been so exciting because I never thought I would actually live to witness something like this. I've been talking about abolition since 1971. And I always thought I was talking about the future, maybe the 22nd century, maybe the 23rd century. And I'm so excited now because I feel as if I'm witnessing this moment for all of those who are no longer here.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. And just a follow-up question, because I think what you said about the confluence of events really allowing this to happen in a really special way in this time, but reminding us that movements have set the stage for this. So George Floyd's murder and the related uprisings, I think for the first time in that confluence of events, sparked, first time in decades, I would say, sparked worldwide outrage and horror about the blatant racism, specifically against Black people. Anti-Black racism became the rallying call for systemic change. But as many of us suspected, reports are already showing that this attention may be short-lived. So what is the responsibility of intersectional movements to continue to shed light and address the unique and distinct and critical role of anti-Black racism in the oppression of all people? I mean, how can we be intersectional but still make sure anti-Black racism stays front and center in the struggle?
Well, first of all, we're no longer in that moment of massive demonstrations every day. And sometimes people feel depressed because that moment seems to have passed. But we cannot live at that level of intensity all the time. It's not possible. And movements experience ebbs and flows. And at the same time, it's important to do work that can only be done in these relatively quiet moments. So in my opinion, this is the period when the real work happens. When we experience the uprisings and demonstrations and we come together, that has an important impact on the way in which we imagine the future, because we see that we are millions strong and we want another world. We want a better world. It's what the cultural theorist John Berger called rehearsal for revolution. But But then in order for that change to happen, we have to begin to work on the institutions. The German activist Rudi Dutschke years ago said that what we have to do is engage in what he called a long march through the institutions, transforming the institutions, transforming the educational institutions, transforming the healthcare institutions, transforming housing, challenging the ways in which houseless people are treated, and so forth and so on. And doing that work does not necessarily put us in the spotlight. But I think it's the important work that can happen as a consequence of recognizing that so many people are with us. So I think it's perhaps important to generate even more excitement about this moment when we're actually trying to engage in concrete strategies for change, in which we're saying that it's not enough simply to talk about diversity and what is it? DEI, inclusion, and it's not enough to get a diversity officer. That we have to talk about justice. We have to talk about transformation. And I think more people recognize that than ever before. So this is the moment to actually do the work and to recognize that the Black liberation movement has always been central to every struggle for democracy, not only in this country, but the Black liberation movement in this hemisphere. And I'm not only talking about the US, I'm talking about the Haitian Revolution, for example. I'm talking about struggles in Brazil. I'm talking about the fact that at this very moment, there is a young a woman in Colombia by the name of Francia Marquez, who is an environmental activist, and she has plans to run for the president of Colombia. So all of these changes are happening. And I think as we insist on a deep understanding of anti-Black racism, as Black people, we should also insist on resisting anti-Indigenous racism, racism directed against Latinx communities, anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia. And I'm remembering Betita Martinez's words, Elizabeth Betita Martinez, who counseled us not to engage in oppression Olympics. It's counterproductive to say that this example of racism is more important than the other. And I think as Black people, we have benefited from being involved in struggles against other expressions of racism. For example, the solidarity with the Palestinian people and challenging the occupation of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. We've learned, as a matter of fact, our struggle against police violence benefited a great deal from that solidarity with the Palestinian people, because we learned about the ways in which it was important to challenge the militarization of the police. And in Ferguson, of course, when we saw those police with all of the military garb and the military weapons and the tanks and so forth, and then we recognized that so many police departments have been trained by the Israeli army, and that there is a global dimension to the work that we do against anti-Black racist police violence. So I As a matter of fact, during this period, I really try to insist on a kind of internationalism that will keep us connected with what's going on around the world, and a feminism that will allow us to recognize the important work that women, especially Black women, have played and are playing during this period, and not only in this country, but all over the world.
Thank you so much. Just want to do a shout out to all of the folks that are speaking up and talking about how much you have influenced their lives. There are hundreds of people now chatting about that. A special shout out to the sister who said that she was named after Angela Davis in the audience.
Inspiring in so many ways and so many levels. Dr. Davis, you've spoken about the insidious relationship between racism and the proliferation of the prison industrial complex. And you've also spoken and written extensively about the political vision of prison abolition. And I want to read a quote to you that I have found inspiring. In my role, I'm a managing director at the California Endowment for our Justice Reinvestment body of work. And you wrote, abolitionist approaches ask us to enlarge our field of vision so that rather than focusing myopically on the problematic institution and asking what needs to be changed about that institution, we raise radical questions about the organization of the larger society. And you've touched on this a little bit in talking about these times and what's been happening in terms of the uprisings. But over the last couple of years, we've actually seen many abolitionist ideas become seated in different ways, in different forms, and become a part of the public discourse. And it's met with a broad range of responses that range from really strong support and elevation and celebration of the ideas to powerful backlash and even demonizing of these concepts and ideas. Do you believe that the terrain of the struggle around the ideas of prison abolition has shifted? And what does history teach us about how to wage the struggle in different political contexts?
Yes, I do believe the terrain has shifted and in very important ways. I can perhaps give one example. Back in the late 1990s, when a number of us were organizing a gathering that would bring people together doing radical work against prisons, doing anti-prison work. We were all abolitionists, but we knew that if we simply invited people to join a movement to get rid of prisons, they would think we were absolutely out of our minds, and that we had a lot of educational work to do. The term prison industrial complex came out of those discussions. It was a term that had been used by the scholar activist Mike Davis to describe the economy of California that was shifting from an agricultural economy to an economy that centered prisons. And we decided to adopt that term to look at what was happening with the increasing incarceration of vast numbers of Black people and people of color at a time when global capitalism was creating enormous changes. That is to say, privatizing healthcare, privatizing education, getting rid of welfare, dismantling the institutions that were designed to provide human services to people. And at the same time, during the 1980s, with the rise of global capitalism, industry was migrating out of the country toward areas in the world where labor was a lot cheaper. So you saw the auto industry in Detroit in decline. You saw the iron, the steel industry in For example, Birmingham, where I grew up, Birmingham was a big steel city. It was called the Pittsburgh of the South. And almost all of my friends' fathers worked either in the mines or in the mills, in the iron ore mines or the steel mills. Eventually, every single steel mill closed. It shut down. And so there was a situation, of course, Black people are always the last hired and the first fired, where many people were trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and they were engaging in activities that are considered quote unquote criminal in order to eat. And so what we thought was that if we tried to explain the workings of what we call the prison industrial complex, that it would help to dismantle some of the ideological assumptions about the role that prisons play. At that particular time, many people were under the impression that you do the crime, you do the time, that prisons are just natural. This is what happens. And at the same time, many people were very ashamed that they had family members behind bars. So we sought to shift the discourse and to point out that the vast majority of people of color behind bars were not there primarily because they committed a crime, even though they may have committed activity that was criminalized. They were there because of this shift in the larger economies. They were there because of these world historical changes. And by the way, the very same changes led to migration. Migration from Central America, migration from the Caribbean, and what we're witnessing today. So we try to make these connections to make it clear that work against the prison industrial complex would help us in our effort to envision a new world. So I'll just say one final thing. The question we ask, and I'm going back to the point that was made earlier by Tamu, I believe, that it wasn't so much about how to change the prison, how to reform it, because the whole history of prisons has been the history of reform. And precisely because of reforms, these institutions have often become even more repressive. So the question we asked was, how can we create a society that no longer has to rely on these racist and repressive institutions? And that's the abolitionist imagination.
And if I might ask a follow-up on that, because I think part of the idea that is often challenging and people struggle with around this is because it is something that has not been seen before. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are about what the role that narrative plays in changing that terrain around people's holding of the idea of abolition.
Well, I think a narrative plays an enormous role. And what so many of us have been trying to do all of these decades is to encourage people to think a bit more critically about an institution that appears to be permanent, and to point out that this institution of the prison is relatively young when you consider human history. It hasn't really been around that long. It dates from around the same time as the American Revolution. And if we recognize that it is an institution that came into history, then it can also be an institution that goes out of history. We can find other ways of addressing the problems that certainly the prison has proven absolutely incapable of effectively addressing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. So we're going to pivot a little bit again to getting a little more personal, but political too. I want to talk about something very exciting that's happening in your life. I mean, I assume it's exciting to you. Last week or a week and a half ago, the Zimmerli Art Museum at Rutgers held the opening event of what is being called a groundbreaking exhibition that documents the depth, scale, and influence of your activism through a collection of photos, graphic art, posters, court sketches, and other materials. It's called Angela Davis Seize the Time. First of all, congratulations for that exhibit. And I know, because I'm here in Oakland, and I know my friend Lisbeth Telfison, it's come out of her personal archive. She's our personal hero here too, that's done so much work at documenting and archiving our history, particularly Black feminist history. So I know Lisbeth's work and just want to lift her up as well. So why don't you just first of all know, what was your involvement in the exhibit? And what artifacts stand out as especially memorable for you?
Well, yeah, Lisbeth gets all of the credit because she's the one who did the collecting. She's the collector, she's the archivist, while I saw some of these materials when I was in jail, people brought them in for me to see. I didn't see the vast majority of them, because I was behind bars. And I think that what I want to say is that the importance of that campaign had so little to do with me as an individual. I was doing what I could, but I was in jail. I was trying to work with my sisters who were behind bars. I was trying to write articles. I was doing those things, but I couldn't do the organizing work that made this campaign so amazingly successful. That work was done by vast numbers of people, the names of whom we'll never really know. Whenever I travel to a country for the first time, I always try to thank people in that country who were involved in the campaign for my freedom. And wherever I go, I try to do that. When I went to Palestine, I did that, and I told my comrades in Palestine that when I was in jail, my lawyer brought a message of solidarity that was smuggled out of an Israeli jail that was signed by Palestinian political prisoners. And I happened to meet a former political prisoner who told me that he was one of the people who had signed that message. I have experiences like that all over the world. I recently went to Uruguay and Martinique for the first time. And again, it was the same experience. People telling me about the work that they did when I was in jail. And see, that is about the power of people when they come together across national borders, across racial boundaries. And no one would have ever thought that it was going to be possible to free me. People who were convinced that I was innocent, nevertheless, looked at Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, J. Edgar Hoover, and they said, there is no way to win this battle. But people came together and demonstrated that it could be done. To me, that's the important message. That's the message of the exhibition at Rutgers University. at the Zimmerlein Museum. And that, by the way, that exhibition is coming to Oakland because it was
Yes,
by,
yes.
the Oakland Museum of California. And then there's also an exhibition in Dresden in Germany. Yeah, I used to feel really overwhelmed by all of this, realizing that this is so much greater than one individual, and I used to feel as if there was no way I could measure up to all of the expectations. But then I had to realize that it was not about me. It's not about an individual. It's about the power of people, the power of people who come together. And we need these messages now more than ever before. So I'm glad that the exhibition is taking place. I can't claim any credit for it, just as I can't claim any credit for the movement. But I do appreciate the work of, deeply appreciate the work of Lisbeth and Renee de Guzman here in Oakland, and others, Thomas Solonovsky, who I think the head of the museum in Rutgers, who died before the actual exhibition. I think he died in 2020. So I'm really thankful to the work that they did, not because I need recognition, because I don't. I don't need any individual recognition. Now, what I want people to recognize is the movement, and that movement will continue.
Well, that is very gracious of you, Dr. Davis, but you deserve the recognition so much so. And I'm so happy that this exhibit is one way to honor you and honor your work. And I'm so happy that it's coming to Oakland, where I live. So I'm going to be looking for that. But I wonder also if you could talk a little bit about the role of art, culture, and media. Thinking about the exhibit. I mean, I think that we really do, that's short shrift. There's a short shrift to the role that art, media, culture play. And I know that, you love jazz music, you're a jazz enthusiast. In fact, one of my dear friends that's on this right now, her family sits behind you at the Monterey Jazz Festival, the night band. So I've had several conversations with you. So shout out to Deb Knight, who's here in the audience. And why don't you just talk about the images? They tell such a great story. What do you think they say about the role of art, culture, and media in shaping movements? And I would say including the shaping of Black radical feminism, because I think obviously you are one of the leading voices.
Well, I don't think we sufficiently recognize the role that art plays in helping us to imagine how the world can be changed. Art helps us to discover futures that require us to give up the present. Art, whether you're talking about visual art, whether you're talking about music, whether you're talking about film, art is so absolutely necessary to human beings. And as a Black person, when I think about the history of Black people of African descent in this hemisphere, I recognize that the value of the Black struggle resides not so much in resisting slavery, although it does, not so much in being able to survive despite the violence. But what is so remarkable about the struggle for Black liberation. And it's why I think people all over the world identify with that struggle, is that Black people not only stood up to the most unspeakable forms of violence, but fought against it and learned at the same time how to create beauty in the process of engaging in that struggle. And jazz, of course, is our gift to the world. And I think we don't often connect the creation of art and music to our struggles as not illustrative or not in the entertainment, but rather as the very heart of our struggles, the very soul of our struggles. You know, what would we be like in this country without the novels of Toni Morrison? Where would we be? We certainly would not be where we are today if Toni, who was a dear friend of mine, and I miss her so much during this period, had not insisted on the subjectivities of Black people who were enslaved, if she had not insisted that we did not need a white gaze, we did not need to be translated through white ways of seeing. And, you know, as someone who had the opportunity to get to know Toni over many decades, I'm appreciative to the fact that she was the editor for my autobiography and taught me how to write in so many ways. And I got to experience up close, you know, what it means for an artist to engage in the kind of world-changing creative activity that leads us to new futures.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. I think I'm going to turn it to Tamu. Tamu, why don't you ask the next question?
It feels like it would not be appropriate for us to not acknowledge the fact that this whole session is being hosted by a philanthropic organization.
Yes.
California Endowment is one of the largest philanthropic organizations in California, and our leadership in a really great way is really committed to taking the institution on this journey of becoming an anti-racist organization in our practice and aligning grant making with community organizing and power building and long-term systemic change. And while we know that American philanthropy has historically played an important role in supporting civil rights and movement work, we're also really clear that the philanthropic sector in this country is really wrought with many and deep contradictions. And the sector can be used as a vehicle for supporting the most racist and reactionary institutions and movements in this country. And even those who are well-intentioned and social justice oriented are still bound by their history and ties to financial markets. That said, the nonprofit sector and the majority of social justice organizations and movements in this country are really intertwined with philanthropic resources. So we wanted to ask, what challenges would you put to both philanthropic institutions that say they're committed to social justice and addressing the root causes of systemic racism, and the movement groups that depend on their funding?
Well, that's a huge question. And as I was saying before the program actually began to Dr. Ross, that I've been very impressed by the California Endowment for many years. I was on the board of an organization called the National Black Women's Health Project, which is now the National Black Women's Health Imperative, which in many ways pioneered the notion of the connections between physical health and spiritual health and mental health. And I learned a great deal from my time with that organization. And I've also worked with other organizations that have been funded by the California Endowment. But of course, as you pointed out, the whole philanthropic community has links to the capitalist system. And those of us who argue that capitalism is racial capitalism. As a matter of fact, that we cannot imagine ending racism without also challenging capitalism. That having been said, there is important work for philanthropic organizations that are aware of the restrictions and the problems. There are some foundations that try to drive the direction of the groups that they fund, that are unwilling to let organizations experiment and explore. And in that sense, they hold back whatever creative impulses the organizations might be developing. I think that given that foundation funding is the way grassroots organizations function these days, it just seems like it happened within a very short period of time. When I was an activist in Los Angeles in the 1960s, we raised money by going around to people literally to ask them to donate to our cause. We did not have funding. That structure did not exist. But now that the structure does exist, a structure that is sometimes called the nonprofit industrial complex, it is important, I think, to recognize that foundations can play a radical role. And that, I think, involves not attempting to steer movements in particular directions, but recognizing that change happens, oftentimes as a direct consequence of allowing people to and organizations to explore new terrain. So I'm really thankful to the work that the California Endowment is doing. And I'm thankful especially for the recognition of incarceration as a public health issue, and recognizing that we can't fix the problem given the tools that have been offered to us, that we have to ask larger questions. We have to ask how we change the world, how we change our country, how we change our communities, so that we no longer have to rely on these instruments of racism and repression. And so I thank you for that, and I hope that you will present your approach to other philanthropic organizations and encourage them to recognize that they should perhaps be doing the following and not the leading.
Well, Tamu, let's see if we have jobs after this. Dr. Dr. Davis, we are nearly.
You always have to push.
It gets us in trouble, though, Dr. Davis. It gets us in trouble.
Good trouble, yeah. Right? Don't we all want good trouble?
Yes, indeed.
Exactly.
Yes, indeed.
Exactly. So Dr. Davis, we are nearly at the end of our time. It's way too short. And I'm so thankful for the time that we did have, but we did want to make sure that we didn't end our conversation without giving you time to share an important call to action. You've always reminded us. Every time I've heard a speech from you, listen to you talk, you say, we need to seize the time and take advantage. And so we want to give you the opportunity to draw our attention. We have now over thousands of people on the call, and so can you what would you ask of the several thousand people that are on the call? What is your call to action today?
Well, my call to action is always a call to encourage people to think deeply about their own passions, their own desires, their own aspirations, and to figure out ways to connect those passions, those aspirations with larger struggles for justice, for democracy, for freedom. People are sometimes under the impression that in order to make important contributions, they have to stop what they're doing and do something else, join an organization and do something else. Of course, I want people to join organizations because we rarely make change if we work only as individuals. So create collectives, join collectives, but also recognize that if this is going to be a lifetime commitment on your part, it must involve something that you really love. It must involve your own passions. And myself, I've always been interested in ideas. That's why I studied philosophy, but I studied philosophy so that I would better understand the way ideas can help to change the world. But I would ask you to look around in your communities, become involved in the many different movements that are cultural movements. There are art movements in every community now. If you like to organize, become involved in those movements that need the kind of organizers to go out and encourage more people to come into our movements. But whatever you do, recognize that you're not alone. And together, we will win. I can guarantee you, we will win.
Yes.
I love that. And I cannot think of a better way to end this really powerful conversation. Dr. Davis, you have left us all inspired. And this has certainly stoked my own fire and the work that I do every day. And it's clear from the audience response, they are fired up too. So thank you so much for talking to us tonight. To the audience, thank you for being here and being so active, engaged in the chat. And I hope that this continues to force other conversations outside of the time with us today. So watch your inboxes for a link to a recording of the event. You can share it with your friends who couldn't be here or take another look at it yourself because there was so much happening in the chat. I wish I could have followed along, but couldn't. And again, Dr. Davis, just incredible richness of wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Before we leave tonight, I want to invite you all to join us on November 16th for a slightly different kind of conversation, but still exciting. CalEndow Live is excited to host 2 award-winning novelists who are reshaping the #1 best-selling fiction genre, which is the romance novel. Alicia Rai says that one of her key missions is destigmatizing mental illness. And she writes that in real life, we often carry trauma and issues, and our brains are wonderfully unique. And that she loves writing characters who are loved for their whole selves. And if you see a character as a whole person, it's hard not to be sensitive to them. And that's what really inspires her in her writings. Jasmine Guillory will share how her experiences working with the California Endowment's #SchoolsNotPrisons campaign contributed to the plot for her best-selling novel, Wedding Dates, or her best-selling Wedding Date series. And we are going to chat out, if we haven't already, the registration link now. So sign up tonight, reserve your seat. And thank you all again for coming out tonight. This has been an incredible experience. I know I will never forget this. Everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Dr. Davis.